everybody. Welcome. I'm Carol Johnson. I'm the director of Amherst Cinema. Believe me, most people don't do that when they see me coming. Usually I'm on stage here introducing something and telling you all about what we do here. I want to keep it brief because we have a really special program. I want to say 2 words of thanks. One is to everyone in here who is a member. Would you hold up your hand if you're a member? Well, that's really impressive. Please look around and thank those people to your left and your right. Because memberships are what keep this place going. We get about 2/3 of what we need from ticket sales and concessions, and the other third is from memberships and donations. So you're really a part of what makes this special, what makes it possible for us to be here. And the other word of thanks is to Nina Kleinberg, who you're going to hear. And I can tell she's got a fan base. This is the second of 3 programs that she's giving, and I have to tell you, after last week, I spent probably 48 hours thinking about what she said and what the film was about, and she really put it in great context. And I feel like it's like going to graduate school in film and having someone who's really knowledgeable tell you about it. Next week we have The Searchers. It's a very seminal film. We could talk for hours about it. But right now I just want to turn it over to Nina. She's going to stay afterward for at least a short while for Q&A if you would like to stay and talk about what you see on the film on the screen tonight. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to Nina Kleinberg.
Last week there was a little trouble with the microphone, so shout out if you can't hear me, okay? I want to welcome you to the second evening in our series, Print the Legend, Classic American Westerns. And as I said last time, I want to remind you that these films take place 150 years ago, and there were no cell phones back then. If you wanted to communicate, you had smoke signals, you had the Pony Express, you had the telegraph. Otherwise, please, no communication with the outside world. Now, last week we had a quick run-through of American history. We looked at westward expansion from the time of the arrival of the earliest Europeans, and we looked at the development of some of the myths of the Old West.
Well, who's talking to you?
I'm talking to you, Tramper.
And I want to know anything from you, I'll tell you, you long-legged son of a...
You want to call me that? Smile.
So we had the cowboy with the white hat and the villain in black, and the cowboy's quick on the draw, and he's a moral figure. And just as the time when the frontier was closing and there was nostalgia for the Old West, we had the very fortuitous development of the movie camera. And movies became a national preoccupation. Then we also followed the Western genre through the advent of sound films. The very first film shot outdoors in sound was a Western. It's the Cisco Kid.
Lift him out, Claude, no trip. Draw down the gun.
We looked at the advent of the so-called Westerns for grown-ups with the movie Stagecoach. And we talked about what happened at the end of World War II when Americans turned their interest to more serious topics and Westerns turned their eyes not just to the sweeping visuals and the usual tropes, but the characters' psychology, their inner conflicts, their moral dilemmas. And Red River, our film last week, which was released in 1948, was produced during those transitional years. Today we're going to examine the time from after World War II until the mid-1950s, and we'll see what was happening in American political life during those years. And we're also going to look at changes in the movie industries and the public's taste for what it wanted to see on the screen. Now, these 7 years or so after the war, Americans came home to a very different country. They came home, they'd been drawn to the war from farms and factories, small towns and big cities, places unimaginable to them. They saw violence, they saw sudden death. Women joined the workforce. Things were changing, and their taste in movies was changing too. Now, we had won the war, but it was a question of whether or not we would win the peace. And Russia, who had been our ally, was now our declared enemy, and it seemed only a matter of time before we'd be in some kind of war, possibly a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. In Washington, they addressed this with the House Un-American Activities Committee. And you may recognize a future president there on the right. It was good publicity to look at Hollywood and call all these big stars in to talk about their un-American activities. And in 1947, left-wing members of the film community were called before HUAC and asked to denounce the party, the Communist Party, and name names of others who'd been members.
Calling the House Un-American Activities Committee to order, Chairman J. Parnell Thomas of New Jersey opens an inquiry into possible communist penetration of the Hollywood film industry. The committee is seeking to determine if Red Party members have reached the screen with subversive propaganda. Mr. Thomas takes an impartial stand in his opening talk.
I want to emphasize at the outset of these hearings that the fact that the Committee on Un-American Activities is investigating alleged communist influence and infiltration in the moving picture industry must not be considered or interpreted as an attack on the industry itself.
A long list of prominent motion picture witnesses appear before the committee.
One of the 19 subpoenaed witnesses was Screenwriters Guild founder John Howard Lawson. Lawson and 9 others were held in contempt of Congress for exercising the right of free speech. They became known as the Hollywood 10, and in 1950 were jailed. Ironically, their accuser, Chairman Thomas, was imprisoned for graft that same year.
Now, these are some of the big moguls who ran their studios like feudal barons. You've got Louis Mayer from MGM, Sam Goldwyn, Goldwyn Pictures, Barney Balaban, I think was at Paramount, Harry Conn at Columbia, and Albert Warner, one of the Warner brothers. They were nursing a lot of grudges at this point, and they had a lot of fears. In the 1930s, they had to import talent from Chicago, from New York, to deal with the fact that they needed people who knew how to act in sound pictures and how to write pictures. And these out-of-towners from the East had the nerve to form unions. The Writers Guild, the Screen Actors Guild, and they really challenged the stranglehold that these folks had on the film industry. The moguls were also fighting a battle in the Supreme Court, because up until this point, film industry was a huge vertical monopoly. Each one of the studios owned the means of production, they owned the distribution chains, and they owned the theaters, which meant it didn't really matter what they turned out. They always had an audience for their films. And that guarantee of exhibition and therefore profit came to an end in 1948 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against this organization of the film industry under the antitrust laws. And this is what was known as the Paramount case, and it was the beginning of the end of the studio system. These moguls willingly threw the Hollywood 10 under the bus. They were happy to get rid of these left-wing troublemakers, and they got together and wrote what was known as the infamous Waldorf statement.
The moguls of the film industry met at New York's Waldorf Astoria and returned to Hollywood to declare that only the 10 would be sacrificed.
We will forthwith discharge or suspend without compensation those in our employ, and we will not re-employ any of the 10 until such time as he is acquitted or has purged himself of contempt and declares under oath that he is not a communist. We request Congress,
But the 10 were only the beginning. Scores more followed.
to rid itself of subversive, disloyal elements.
In 1950, the right-wing journal Counterattack published a pamphlet entitled Red Channels. It was a report of communist influence, and it named 151 members of the film and radio community who reported to be subversives. It was the beginning of the blacklist, but it would grow to much longer. There's Orson Welles' listing, and Leonard Bernstein's, and there's Langston Hughes. It was very far-ranging, and mere innuendo could get you on what was called the gray list. You really wouldn't know why you couldn't get a job, but somehow, someone had named your name. Was it a meeting you attended in the 40s? Did someone mention your name to someone because they didn't like you? Hundreds of people who had made their living in the film industry found that they had lost their livelihood. In addition to this change of events came a difference in what the public wanted. Now, there used to be a saying in Hollywood, if you want to send a message, call Western Union. And I suppose today we'd say send an email or put it on Facebook, but the point was clear, nobody wanted to be preached at in the movies. And at least that's what the folks thought who ran the film industry. But the years after the war saw a really increased interest in and box office receipts for films with a social message. You had William Wyler's masterpiece, The Best Years of Our Lives, tackling the problems of the returning veterans. You had The Lost Weekend, Billy Wilder's great film about alcoholism. Previously, alcoholism had been treated as, oh, people who were drunk were funny, or they were suave, or they were there for comic relief, or it was just normal to get drunk. This took a serious look at alcoholism. Then you had Gentleman's Agreement and Crossfire that focused on anti-Semitism. And just of note, that film Crossfire, both the producer and the director of Crossfire eventually were members of the Hollywood 10. And then you had Elia Kazan's Pinky and Home of the Brave, which dealt with racism, anti-black racism. Movies were starting to grow up, and with them, Westerns started to grow up too. The old myths were no longer inviolable. Here's an early example of a film made during World War II that shows how good people could be influenced to perform evil deeds.
All right, put them up. There are you.
I don't want to die.
Anytime you're ready, Mr. Mapes.
Well, we'll stop there, but that's not going to end well. And this was at a time when Roosevelt actually had refused to sign anti-lynching laws. A very interesting film. I recommend you see it. Then you've got John Ford's Fort Apache, and the dichotomy of good soldiers and bad Native Americans was completely rejected. It was one of the first films to portray Native Americans sympathetically, and it had Henry Ford as a racist cavalry officer modeled on Custer, who gets his entire troop killed.
Colonel, if you send out the regiment, Cochise will think I've tricked him.
Exactly. We have tricked him into returning to American soil, and I intend to see that he stays here.
Colonel, Thursday, I gave my word to Cochise. No man is going to make a liar out of me, sir.
Your word to a breech-clouded savage, an illiterate, uncivilized murderer and treaty breaker? There's no question of honor, sir, between an American officer and Cochise.
There is to me, sir.
Captain York, you may have commanded your own regiment in the late war, but so long as you command a troop in mine, you will obey my orders.
The movies began to question even gunfighters and people who were quick on the draw and asking questions about guns and violence. There's a beautiful film, I'll show you a little bit of it, called The Gunfighter. And if you haven't seen this film, I really recommend you do. It stars Gregory Peck, who's a man who has built his reputation as the fastest draw. And for him, this reputation becomes a curse. He can't get away from it.
I want to know what you meant by that remark you passed.
How come I gotta run into a squirt like you nearly every place I go these days? What are you trying to do, show off in front of your friends?
Are you ready to back up that remark or not?
What about this? Ain't some of you fellas in charge of this donkey?
I'm telling you, Mr. Ringo.
Eddie don't mean no real harm, Mr. Ringo.
Then let Eddie keep his big ugly nose out of my business if he don't want to get it slapped. Did you see that?
Yes, sir. He drew first.
Did you see it?
Yeah, I saw it. Yes, sir, I saw it. Except I'd get on out of town anyway if I was you.
Why?
Because he's got 3 brothers that ain't gonna care who drew first.
Movies started to ask hard questions. Western movies. Was violence always a precursor to peaceful civilization? Was violence needed once law and order had been established? What is the meaning of courage? What did the individual owe to their community? And what did the community owe to the individual in return? And all of these things are brought into question in today's film. High Noon found its roots in all of these trends: the status of the United States in the post-war years, the fear of communism, the blacklist, and it developed in a Hollywood that was no longer under the thumb of the major studios. So as a result of the Paramount case, you could have independent producers who could put together the financing and make their own films without being denied access to distribution and exhibition. It questioned many of the accepted themes of Western movies. The film was produced by Stanley Kramer and Carl Foreman, and an understanding of their relationship and their ultimate disaffection from one another is the personal side to this story. They had met during the war, and they decided to put together their own production company, almost impossible before the breakup of the studios. They were known for making films with a social message. Together they made Champion. This was their first film. It was about a crooked boxer. It starred Kirk Douglas. Despite being produced on a tiny budget, compared to the inflated costs of the studio system, it went on to be nominated for several Academy Awards, including one for Carl Foreman's script. After this, they made Home of the Brave. We've already mentioned that, about black anti-racism. And then they followed it with a film called The Men. This was Marlon Brando's very first film, and it was about a paraplegic war veteran. Their last film together was High Noon. Carl Foreman began writing it in 1948, and he thought of it as a parable about, of all things, the United Nations, thinking about how important it would be for nations to work together to achieve world peace. He had decided he wanted to write a film in real time, and even the concept of films in real time, meaning the hour and a half or so that the film was on the screen actually represented an hour and a half of real time. And he liked the idea of doing a Western, but he was tired of cattle drives and Vista He wanted to make a Western that was more about human values. But then the blacklist intervened. While working on the script, there were rumors that he might be called before HUAC. He had belonged to the Communist Party in the 40s. He had left 10 years earlier. And people in his position were left with an impossible choice. Do you go in front of HUAC? Do you name the names of the other communists you knew and get to keep your job? Or do you follow your conscience and refuse to name names? He could not bring himself to name names. And there was fear that any connection with him would draw people into the blacklist. And as this happened, his script became more and more about one man alone, finding himself alone with a terrible situation. Some of the dialogue in this film is actually verbatim what people said to him when he was trying to figure out what to do about the blacklist. When he was finally called to testify, he refused to name names, and there were fears that his performance would destroy Kramer Productions, which was in high-level negotiations with Columbia, and would destroy High Noon. He actually volunteered to withdraw from the production, and Kramer wanted him to withdraw. Kramer was afraid that he would destroy what they had put together. But interestingly enough, the film star Gary Cooper supported supported Foreman. And this is interesting because Gary Cooper was one of the most vocal right-wing anti-communists in Hollywood, right alongside his buddies John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart. They were in an organization called the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. And they were happy to see the Hollywood 10 go to jail. But Cooper was also a man of honor. He liked Foreman, and he and the director Fred Zinnemann went to Kramer and they said, "We will leave this production if Carl Foreman is gone." So Foreman actually lost the producing credit on High Noon, but he did keep the writing credit. And it was the end of a lengthy and productive relationship with Stanley Kramer. The two of them literally never spoke again. The film is directed by Fred Zinnemann. You've seen a lot of his films. He was an Austrian emigre who had first worked with Kramer and Foreman on The Men. And he loved this project because it was about conscience versus compromise. And he worked very closely with Floyd Crosby, the cinematographer, to give the film a realistic look. They actually went through books and books of Matthew Brady's photos from the Civil War. That's the look they wanted to achieve. And you'll notice through the film, you've got burnt out skies, stark black and white. There's nothing pretty in this film. It's kind of an anti-Western. The film is edited by Elma Williams, and anybody who's been to my talks knows I always give a shout out to the editor, because we editors know that we're the ones who really make the films. He was an experienced editor when he took on High Noon, but this is the film that he's remembered for. The story had great potential, but given how little action there is in this movie, it's amazing how much tension his editing brings to this film. There are no dissolves, there are no fades, there's just cut after cut to the music, and the tension builds because of the way this film is edited. The score is by Dmitri Tiomkin, who also scored last week's picture, and again, one of those great European composers who came to Hollywood and essentially invented the art of the film score. He also wrote the iconic song, "Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling," which would be a big hit for him and for Tex Ritter, who was a big country western star. The star of the film is the wonderful Gary Cooper. And they had talked about all different kinds of people who they might want for this film, including Gregory Peck, Kirk Douglas, Burt Lancaster, Charlton Heston, even Marlon Brando. I cannot imagine what this film would be like if Marlon Brando were the head. But at this point, they were all really big stars, and they were used to getting enormous salaries. And Kramer and Foreman couldn't afford these salaries. Cooper, on the other hand, read the script and loved it, and he wanted this part. He'd been a film star since the 1920s. That was him in The Virginian earlier on. But his star was waning. He was in his 50s. He looked old. His back hurt. He had hernia surgery 2 weeks before they started shooting. And there was general concern about how he looked, but he was willing to work for the cut rate price of $100,000. And that's how he got the part. On the other hand, his co-star was Grace Kelly. She was only 20 years old. She had taken acting classes in New York. She'd never starred in a movie. And when she was cast, she was actually in the middle of doing dinner theater in Denver. Kramer was concerned. He said she's too young, too inexperienced, and too nervous. But she looked the part, and she was willing to work for $750 a week. So she got the part. Lloyd Bridges was a graduate at the Actors Lab, the same place that Montgomery Clift had gone to learn acting, and he had appeared in their previous film, The Men. And then there's Katie Jurado. What a fabulous actress. She had been a big star in Mexico, having appeared in 17 films. She'd only been in one other American movie before this. And she had to take English lessons for 2 months just to be able to recite her dialogue. But she plays a very unusual character for a Mexican woman. And you'll see that in the film. Now, a small amount of High Noon was shot on location in Sonora County in Northern California, but mostly it was filmed in Burbank, just over the mountains in the valley from Hollywood. It was shot in 31 days. It was made on a budget of $790,000, which was extremely frugal, even for those days, even for an independent production. And here it is. I hope you enjoy it.